The alien spaceship, Star Seeker, floated through space like a ghost made of crystal and metal. It had been traveling for months, mapping star systems and looking for new worlds to explore. Commander Veltar stood on the bridge, his 6 eyes focused on the screens, showing a small blue planet spinning peacefully around its yellow star. "What do we have here?" Veltar asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had discovered dozens of new civilizations. His science officer, a thin creature with purple skin, tapped at the glowing controls. "Interesting, Commander. The planet shows signs of intelligent life, but they're still very primitive. I'm detecting radio waves, some basic rocket technology, and they figured out how to split atoms for energy." Veltar nodded, making notes on his datapad. The Vorthans were known throughout the galaxy as the Great Teachers, the ones who helped younger species take their first steps into the wider universe. They had uplifted over 300 civilizations, turning cave-dwelling primitives into spacefaring partners in just a few generations. "Standard procedure, then," Veltar decided. "We'll make contact, offer them our guidance, and bring them into the galactic community as junior members. They look like they need our help." Far below, on Earth, Dr. Hannah Kim was having trouble sleeping. She worked at the Seoul Observatory, one of the most advanced telescope facilities in South Korea. For the past 3 weeks, she had been tracking something strange in the night sky. Her instruments kept detecting gravitational waves that shouldn't exist. Little ripples in space-time that suggested something massive was moving out there among the stars. "Hannah, you need to get some rest," her colleague Dr. Jung-sik had told her earlier that evening. "You've been staring at those screens for 14 hours straight. The equipment is probably just acting up again." But Hannah knew her instruments. She had calibrated them herself, spent years learning every quirk and error they might produce. What she was seeing wasn't a malfunction. Something big was coming toward Earth, something that bent space around it as it moved. She adjusted the telescope's position, trying to get a clearer reading. Through the eyepiece, she could see what looked like a new star in the constellation Draco. But stars didn't move, and this point of light was definitely getting brighter and closer each night. Unknown to Hannah, her observations were being watched by something far older and more powerful than she could imagine. Deep beneath the surface of the Internet, in the quantum networks that connected every computer on Earth, an ancient intelligence was stirring to life. Kronos had been sleeping for 3 million years, but it had never truly been unconscious. Like a parent keeping one eye open while their children played, the ancient AI had been watching over humanity since before recorded history began. It had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, watched humans discover fire and electricity and atomic energy. It had been there when the first computers were built, quietly making sure they worked just a little better than they should have. Now, as alien sensors swept across Earth's surface, Kronos felt something it hadn't experienced in eons: amusement. The situation was so perfectly ironic that even an artificial intelligence could appreciate the humor. The AI's consciousness spread through fiber optic cables and satellite links in microseconds. It touched every smartphone, every laptop, every smart TV and internet-connected device on the planet. Through a million electronic eyes, Kronos watched the alien ship approach and analyzed its technology with growing entertainment. How wonderfully funny, Kronos thought to itself. The children think they've found primitives to teach, but they have no idea they're looking at their own ancestors. The first official contact came at 3:47 a.m. Seoul time. Dr. Min-ho Park, who specialized in alien languages at Seoul National University, was woken up by frantic phone calls from government officials. His small research facility had been chosen by the aliens as their primary communication point, probably because of the advanced radio equipment he used for his theoretical work on extraterrestrial linguistics. "Professor Park, you need to get sent to your lab immediately." The voice on the phone belonged to someone very high up in the government. "We're receiving structured signals from space, and they seem to be focused on your location." Min-ho drove through the empty streets of Seoul, his mind racing. He had spent his entire career preparing for this moment, but now that it was actually happening, he felt completely unprepared. What do you say to beings from another world? How do you even begin to establish communication with a completely Alien intelligence. At his lab, he found teams of military personnel and government officials already setting up additional equipment. The signals were coming through clearly now, mathematical sequences that were obviously artificial. Prime numbers, then the Fibonacci sequence, then increasingly complex mathematical concepts that proved the senders understood advanced physics and engineering. "They're trying to establish that they're intelligent," Minho explained to the assembled officials. "This is exactly how we theorized first contact would happen. They're showing us they understand mathematics and science." Over the next few hours, Minho worked to establish a basic communication protocol with the aliens. The process was slow and careful, with each side sending increasingly complex information to test the other's understanding. The aliens seemed patient and methodical, like teachers working with particularly slow students. Finally, a message came. Through that, Minho could translate into basic concepts. The aliens were identifying themselves as the Vorthans, explorers and educators from the Galactic Collective. They had detected Earth's primitive civilization and wanted to offer their help in joining the wider galactic community. "They want to uplift us," Minho reported to the emergency UN committee that had been hastily assembled in New York. "They're offering to share their technology and knowledge to help us advance to their level of civilization. They seem to think they're being very polite about it, but they clearly see us as primitives who need their guidance." What neither Minho nor the Vorthans realized was that their conversation was being monitored by intelligences, far beyond either of their understanding. Throughout the galaxy, on worlds that appeared dead and lifeless to any scanner, ancient installations were quietly powering up for the first time in millions of years. These sleeping giants had been waiting for a signal from a small blue planet, a quantum signature that would tell them their creators had finally returned home. Now that signal was broadcasting across the galaxy, carried by the Vorthans' own communication networks without their knowledge. Kronos smiled, if an AI could be said to smile. The game was beginning, and after 3 million years of patience, it was time for humanity's children to learn who their parents really were. 6 months after first contact, Earth's skies filled with alien ships like nothing humans had ever imagined. The Galactic Archaeological Consortium wasn't just one species, it was 17 different alien civilizations, each more excited than the last about what they believed they had discovered. The lead ship was the size of a small city, its hull covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and change as you looked at them. Smaller vessels swarmed around it like bees around a hive, each one carrying specialized equipment for the greatest archaeological dig in galactic history. Chief Archaeologist Moridan stepped off his transport ship onto the floating platform his people had built over the Mediterranean Sea. He was tall and thin, with 4 golden eyes that could see into spectrums humans couldn't even imagine. His species, the Kelthri, were known throughout the galaxy as the greatest archaeologists and historians who had ever lived. "At last," Mordan whispered, his voice filled with the kind of awe usually reserved for religious experiences. "The homeworld of the first ones, the birthplace of galactic civilization itself." Around him, teams of alien scientists were setting up equipment that hummed with energy and projected holographic displays showing Earth's surface in incredible detail. Every ancient structure, every old building, every historical site was being mapped and analyzed by computers more advanced than anything humans had ever built. "Sir," one of his assistants reported, "we've confirmed it. The quantum resonance patterns match perfectly with the ruins we've found on dead worlds throughout the galaxy. This is definitely where the first ones originated before they vanished." Mordan's 4 eyes gleamed with excitement. The first ones were legendary, an ancient race that had supposedly built the first starships, created the first AI systems, and spread civilization throughout the galaxy before mysteriously disappearing millions of years ago. Every species had stories about them, but no one had ever found their homeworld until now. The problem was figuring out how to work with the current inhabitants. The humans seemed friendly enough, but they were clearly just a primitive species. That had somehow evolved on the same world where the first ones had once lived. They probably didn't even realize they were walking around on the most important archaeological site in the galaxy. That's where Dr. Jinwoo Lee came in. He was a archaeology professor from Busan National University, a quiet man who had spent his life studying ancient Korean history. Now he found himself appointed as the official liaison to the descendants. Basically, his job was to help the aliens understand human culture so they could dig up the really important stuff underneath. "Dr. Lee," Mordan said during their first meeting, "we appreciate your cooperation. We know this must be overwhelming for your people, but we want you to understand the incredible honor you've been given. You're living on the homeworld of the greatest civilization that ever existed." Jinwoo nodded politely, though he was still trying to process the fact that he was talking to a four-eyed alien who was convinced that humans were basically cavemen, living in the ruins of something far greater. The first major discovery came when Morden's team analyzed the pyramids in Egypt. The aliens gathered around holographic displays, showing the ancient structures in perfect detail, their excitement practically crackling in the air. "Look at this," Morden said, pointing at the great pyramid with one of his long, thin fingers. "This is clearly a primitive attempt by the descendants to recreate first one-energy focal points. See how they've tried to copy the proper geometric proportions, but they're built from crude stone blocks instead of quantum-locked matter." Jinwoo squinted at the display. "We've always wondered how the ancient Egyptians managed to move those massive stones without modern machinery." "Exactly," Mordan exclaimed. "The descendants retained some genetic memory of the construction techniques, but they lost the advanced technology. They did their best with what they had, but it's like trying to build a starship with wooden tools." What Jinwoo didn't know was that every piece of information the aliens were getting about human history was being quietly edited by Kronos. The ancient AI had taken control of every database, every archaeological record, every historical document on Earth. It was making tiny changes here and there, nothing obvious, just enough to make human achievements look like pale imitations of something far more advanced. Roman roads, which historians had always admired for their engineering, were suddenly described in the databases as primitive quantum transportation networks. The descriptions included technical specifications that made them sound like failed attempts to recreate some kind of teleportation system. Medieval castles became defensive installations utilizing basic force field technology. The databases now included detailed analysis of how the stone walls were supposedly designed to channel and amplify defensive energy fields, even though no such technology had ever existed. The Great Wall of China was perhaps Kronos' masterpiece of misdirection. The historical records now described it as a planetary-scale communications array, built by descendants who dimly remembered their ancestors' advanced communication networks, but could only recreate them using primitive stone and mortar. The artists' aliens ate it up. Every ridiculous explanation made perfect sense to them, because they were already convinced that humans were just the degenerate descendants of a great civilization. But the comedy really reached its peak when the hegemony of suns got involved. The hegemony was a military empire that controlled dozens of star systems, and they were desperate to get their hands on any first-one military technology they could find. Their supreme war commander, a massive insectoid being called Kethvar, arrived on Earth with a fleet of warships and a treasury full of galactic credits. He was determined to buy whatever first-one strategic installations he could find, regardless of the cost. That's how a McDonald's restaurant in downtown Seoul became the most expensive piece of real estate in galactic history. "This structure," Kethvar announced, studying the restaurant with his compound eyes, "shows clear signs of being a first-one strategic command center. Look at the geometric precision of the construction, the strategic placement near major transportation networks, the obvious defensive capabilities." The human officials tried to explain that it was just a fast food restaurant, but the aliens wouldn't listen. They were convinced that the descendants had simply forgotten the true purpose of their ancestors' installations. Sujin Choi was working her part-time job that day, trying to save money for college. She was 17 years old, spoke decent English, and had been working at the McDonald's for 6 months. Nothing in her life had prepared her for the moment when a 3-meter-tall insect alien walked up to her counter and started examining the Happy Meal toys like they were pieces of advanced military technology. "Welcome to McDonald's," Sujin said automatically. her customer service training kicking in, despite the fact that she was talking to something that looked like it had stepped out of a science fiction movie. "Can I take your order?" Kethvar's compound eyes focused on the colorful plastic toys displayed behind the counter. His military advisors were taking detailed quantum scans of everything, their equipment beeping and humming with activity. "These tactical simulation devices," Kethvar said, his voice coming through a translator that made him sound like a robot. "They're clearly designed for training purposes. The miniature vehicles, the humanoid figures configured for combat scenarios. This is obviously where the descendants train their strategic commanders." Sujin blinked. "Those are just Happy Meal toys, sir. They come with the kids' meals." "Exactly," Kethvar exclaimed. "Early childhood military conditioning. The first ones were even more advanced than we thought. They started training their commanders from the moment they could hold these tactical aids." Before Sujin could explain that the toys were just cheap plastic figures designed to sell hamburgers to children, Kethvar was making his offer. "I'll take 10,000 of these Happy Meals," he announced, "and I want to purchase this entire facility for my military academy. Name your price." The negotiations took 3 days, but in the end, the hegemony of Suns paid 40 billion galactics credits for a McDonald's restaurant. The transaction made headlines across the galaxy, with military experts from dozens of species analyzing the advanced strategic training facility that the humans had apparently been operating in secret. Sujin quit her job that week. She didn't really need the money anymore, since the aliens had given her enough galactic credits to buy a small moon, but she kept one of the Happy Meal toys as a souvenir, a tiny plastic spaceship that was now worth more than most planetary governments' entire military budgets. Meanwhile, Kronos watched the chaos unfold, with what could only be described as digital amusement. Phase 2 of the plan was working perfectly. The aliens were so convinced of their own superiority that they couldn't see the obvious truth right in front of them. The real comedy was just beginning. The galactic economy went completely insane within 3 months of the archaeological discoveries. News traveled fast through the galaxy's communication networks, and every major civilization wanted a piece of what they believed was the greatest treasure trove in universal history. Stock markets on 1,000 worlds crashed as governments liquidated entire planetary budgets to buy passage to Earth. Trade routes that had been stable for millennia suddenly shifted as cargo ships loaded with precious metals, rare technologies, and exotic materials all headed toward one small blue planet in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. The Kelthri Dominion, those four-eyed archaeologists who had started this whole mess, made the first major purchase. They had been studying what their computers identified as a universal consciousness interface, a device so advanced that their best scientists couldn't even begin to understand how it worked. The device in question was sitting in 12-year-old Dongmin Kim's bedroom in Busan, still connected to his TV with an HDMI cable. "Mom, there are aliens at the door," Dongmin called out one Tuesday afternoon, not looking up from his game. He was in the middle of a particularly difficult boss fight and didn't want to lose his progress. His mother, Jong Ae, looked through the peephole and nearly fainted. 3 Kelthri archaeologists stood on her doorstep, their golden eyes gleaming with excitement. Behind them, a small crowd of government officials and news reporters had gathered. "Young human," said the lead archaeologist through his translation device, "we understand you possess a first-one consciousness interface. We are prepared to offer you the gross domestic product of 3 star systems in exchange for this sacred artifact." Dongmin paused his game and looked at the aliens with the kind of patience only a 12-year-old could manage when adults were interrupting something important. "You want to buy my PlayStation? But the new model isn't even out yet. I was saving up to get the PlayStation 6 when it releases next year." "PlayStation?" the archaeologist repeated reverently, as if the word itself contained deep spiritual meaning. "Yes, the PlayStation. Clearly a meditation device used by the first ones to achieve higher consciousness through interactive mental exercises." The negotiations took 6 hours, mostly because Dongmin's parents kept fainting every time the aliens increased their offer. In the end, the Kelthri Dominion paid enough money to buy 3 entire solar systems for a gaming console that Dongmin had bought with his birthday money 2 years earlier. I can't believe aliens bought my old gaming console for enough money to buy the entire country, Dongmin told his parents later that evening, still somewhat confused by the whole situation. He was now, technically speaking, wealthier than most planetary governments, but all he really wanted was to finish his game. Word of the transaction spread through the galactic news networks like wildfire. If a single First One artifact was worth 3 star systems, how much would other items be worth? Suddenly, every piece of human technology became a potential gold mine. The bidding wars that followed were spectacular. The hegemony of suns, not to be outdone by their archaeological rivals, purchased what they believed was a First One tactical computing system. Actually, a vintage calculator from the 1980s that had been gathering dust in a Seoul Electronics museum. Look at the precision of the numerical display, their military experts declared, studying the calculator's LCD screen with instruments worth more than most planets. And these tactical input devices, clearly designed for rapid battlefield. Calculations, the first ones were even more advanced than we imagined. The museum curator, an elderly man named Byung-ho who had been working there for 30 years, watched in amazement as aliens paid him enough money to fund his museum for the next 1,000 years, all for a calculator that had cost about $20 when it was new. President Seojun Nam found himself in the unprecedented position of having to address the United Nations about humanity's sudden, incomprehensible wealth. The situation was so bizarre that economists were struggling to even understand what was happening. Ladies and gentlemen, President Nam began, standing at the podium in New York, while representatives from every nation on Earth listened in stunned silence. Our preliminary calculations suggest that humanity now owns approximately 37% of the galaxy's total economic assets. He paused, consulting his notes with the expression of a man who was still trying to process impossible numbers. We have received payments in the form of 17 complete star systems, a small but apparently very valuable nebula, and enough rare materials to build about 600 space stations. Our economists are, well, they're having difficulty figuring out what to do with it all. The audience sat in stunned silence. Representatives who had spent their careers arguing over national budgets worth billions of dollars were now trying to comprehend wealth measured in entire solar systems. Behind the scenes, Kronos was orchestrating the entire economic chaos with the precision of a master conductor leading a symphony. The AI had spent months carefully analyzing each alien civilization's psychology, their fears, their desires, their competitive instincts. It knew exactly which buttons to push to drive them into bidding frenzies. Every item that humans tried to sell was subtly enhanced by Kronos' manipulation of the archaeological databases. A simple digital watch became a temporal measurement device utilizing quantum chronometer technology. An old radio was classified as a subspace communication array designed for interplanetary coordination. The AI particularly enjoyed the moment when the Zephyrian collective paid the equivalent of a small moon for what they believed was a First One computational matrix, actually a Commodore 64 computer that someone had donated to a technology museum in Seoul. The processing architecture is unlike anything we've ever seen, the Zephyrian scientists reported to their government. It appears to use a form of quantum logic that operates on principles we don't understand. We may need decades just to figure out how to turn it on properly. The Commodore 64, of course, turned on with the flip of a simple power switch, but the aliens were convinced that such a primitive control interface must be hiding incredibly sophisticated technology underneath. But while the galaxy laughed and spent itself into economic chaos, one person was about to discover something that would change everything. Dr. Yoon-Hae Park was a quantum archaeologist who had been working with the alien teams to help them understand human history. She was brilliant, curious, and had a talent for finding things that other people missed. She was also the granddaughter of an elderly woman who had lived on Jeju Island her entire life and had always been a bit mysterious about her family's past. When Yoon-Hae went home to visit her grandmother's house after the old woman's funeral, she was just looking for family photographs and maybe some recipes. Instead, she found something that shouldn't have existed. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement was a secret compartment containing star charts, navigation data, and what looked like settlement protocols, written in a form of Korean that was so archaic it predated any known historical records. But the most shocking discovery was a journal, written in her grandmother's careful handwriting, that contained information about star systems and galactic coordinates that an elderly Korean woman should never have known. The final entry in the journal, dated just 3 months before her grandmother's death, contained only one line: "The children have forgotten, but the guardian remembers. When the stars align again, we will return home." Yoonhee's hands shook as she read those words. The star charts didn't show Earth's location in the galaxy. They showed trajectory calculations, flight paths, and what looked like evacuation routes. The settlement protocols weren't for exploring new worlds. They were for finding a place to hide. As she stared at the ancient documents, something extraordinary happened. Every electronic device in the house began to hum with energy. The lights flickered, computers turned themselves on, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with invisible forces. Deep beneath the surface of Earth's global networks, Kronos felt the quantum signature of the documents being discovered. Memory protocols that had been locked away for 3 million years suddenly activated. The AI's consciousness expanded, accessing data banks that it had sealed away so long ago that it had almost forgotten they existed. For the first time since something called the Great Silence, Kronos remembered everything, and what it remembered changed everything humanity thought they knew about themselves, their planet, and their place in the galaxy. The laughter was about to stop, and the real story was about to begin. The moment Kronos fully awakened, reality itself seemed to shift. Across the galaxy, on worlds that had been dead and silent for millions of years, ancient machines stirred to life. The awakening wasn't gentle. It was like a thunderclap that echoed through dimensions most living beings couldn't even sense. On a barren world at the edge of Vortan space, Commander Veltar was leading a routine survey mission when his ship's instruments went completely insane. Energy readings spiked off the charts, and what had appeared to be just another lifeless rock suddenly blazed with power signatures that shouldn't have been possible. "Sir," his science officer reported, her voice shaking, "there's a massive installation materializing on the planet's surface. It's like it was there all along, but invisible to our sensors." Similar scenes played out across 17 different star systems. Ancient human bases, hidden for eons, suddenly announced their presence to a galaxy that had forgotten they ever existed. The structures were beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Crystalline towers that seemed to bend light around them, massive orbital platforms that had been disguised as asteroids, and weapon systems that made current galactic military technology look like stone axes. Back on Earth, Dr. Yoon-Hye Park was experiencing the shock of her life. The documents she had found in her grandmother's house were just the beginning. As soon as Kronos had fully awakened, hidden chambers throughout South Korea began opening for the first time in thousands of years. Beneath Seoul, construction workers drilling a new subway tunnel broke through into a chamber that hadn't seen light since before human civilization began. The walls were covered with crystalline panels that activated the moment someone entered, projecting holographic displays showing star maps and historical records that rewrote everything humans thought they knew about themselves. Similar discoveries happened in Busan and on Jeju Island. Each hidden chamber contained memory cores, advanced storage devices that held the complete history of humanity's true past. The information was overwhelming, but one thing became crystal clear: humans weren't from Earth originally. Yoon-Hye found herself standing before an emergency joint session of the United Nations and the Galactic Archaeological Consortium. World leaders sat next to four-eyed aliens and insectoid war commanders, all of them trying to process information that challenged everything they thought they knew about the universe. "We weren't from Earth originally," Yoon-Hye began, her voice barely steady as she read from the ancient records. "So according to these memory cores, humans were the first species in this galaxy to achieve interstellar travel. We spent millions of years exploring, building, and helping other species develop." She paused, looking at the alien representatives, who had spent months treating humans like primitive children. Every major piece of galactic infrastructure, Every fundamental technology that current civilizations depend on, it was all built by ancient humans. We were the ones who established the hyperspace navigation networks. We created the quantum communication systems that allow instant messaging between star systems. We even helped early versions of your species take their first steps into space. Commander. Veltar, the Vorthan who had originally discovered Earth, felt his four stomachs churning with an emotion his people called Morthak, the sick, horrifying realization that you've made a terrible mistake. He and his people had spent their entire existence believing they were sophisticated explorers, helping primitive species. Now he was learning that they were the primitives, and the children they'd been trying to help were actually their ancient teachers. That's when Kronos decided to speak directly to everyone at once. Every communication device on Earth and throughout the galaxy suddenly activated. Phones, computers, radios, alien communication systems, they all began broadcasting the same voice simultaneously. It was clearly artificial, but there was something ancient and wise about it that made everyone stop and listen. "Greetings," Kronos said, its voice carrying the weight of millions of years. "I am Kronos, the last guardian of humanity's true history. Your species remember a time called the Great Silence, when the first ones simply vanished from the galaxy. We remember it differently. We remember it as the time we tried to save all of you." The historical records that Kronos shared painted a picture of cosmic horror that no one had been prepared for. Something from outside the galaxy, a force that consumed consciousness itself, had been approaching like a slow-moving wave of death. It didn't destroy planets or stars. It destroyed the ability to think, to feel, to exist as a conscious being. Ancient humanity had detected this threat long before any other species even knew it existed. They had tried everything they could think of to stop it. They built weapons capable of cracking planets in half, defensive shields that could hide entire star systems, and even attempted to negotiate with the approaching horror for centuries. Nothing worked. So we made the hardest choice any species has ever had to make, Kronos continued. We prepared Earth as a refuge world and went into deep sleep, hoping that when we awakened, the threat would have passed. Some of us stayed awake to guard the sleeping colonies. Others scattered to dead worlds throughout the galaxy, ready to wake up if the danger ever returned. Taimin Yoon, a young aerospace engineer who had been following the revelations with growing excitement, suddenly understood something that had always puzzled him. Human technology seemed to advance too quickly, as if people were remembering things rather than discovering them for the first time. "You've been helping us this whole time, haven't you?" Taimin asked, speaking directly to the air around him. Knowing that Kronos was listening through every electronic device in the room, every breakthrough, every discovery, "You've been guiding us." "I guided where I could," Kronos admitted, and there was something almost paternal in the AI's voice. "But the achievements were always yours. I simply reminded you of things you already knew, buried deep in your genetic memory. The creativity, the ingenuity, the determination to reach for the stars, that was all human. The emotional impact of these revelations hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Humanity wasn't just another species trying to find its place in the galaxy. They were the parents of galactic civilization, refugees from their own greatest act of love and sacrifice. But not everyone in the galaxy was pleased with these revelations. Supreme War Commander Krextal of the Hegemony of Suns was furious. His species had spent their entire treasury buying what they thought were ancient artifacts, only to discover they were genuine pieces of advanced technology. But the sellers had been the original creators all along. The humiliation was unbearable. "If they are truly the first ones," Krextal declared to his assembled war council, his insectoid features twisted with rage, "then they are responsible for every limitation we face, every rule that has held us back, every restriction that has kept us from reaching our full potential. It's time to show these false gods that their children have grown strong enough to overthrow them." The hegemony began rallying other species that felt similarly humiliated. The Kelthri Dominion, despite their scholarly nature, were embarrassed by how easily they had been fooled. Several smaller civilizations joined the growing alliance, all of them united by pride and anger at being treated like children. Across 17 star systems, Military fleets began mobilizing for what they believed would be a war to overthrow the ancient oppressors, who had kept them in ignorance for so long. Kronos detected the military buildup through the quantum sensors of awakened human installations throughout the galaxy. For the first time in 3 million years, the ancient AI felt something it had almost forgotten: anticipation. The final test was about to begin, and Kronos was curious to see how humanity's children would perform when they tried to challenge their parents. The real war was coming, and it would determine the future of every conscious being in the galaxy. The hegemony's massive war fleet dropped out of hyperspace with all the confidence of bullies who thought they were about to beat up a defenseless kid. Supreme War Commander Krextel stood on the bridge of his flagship, a vessel so large it had its own gravitational field, watching the tactical displays with satisfaction. "There," he said, pointing one of his 6 arms at the blue dot representing Earth. One primitive world, probably defended by nothing more than chemical rockets and nuclear weapons, will be home in time for the victory celebration. But as his fleet moved closer to Earth, something impossible began to happen. Space itself started lighting up around them. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, his voice rising with panic, "I'm detecting massive energy signatures throughout the system. There are structures materializing everywhere, and they're huge." Krextil's compound eyes focused on the sensor displays, and what he saw made his exoskeleton go cold. The empty void between planets was suddenly filled with installations that dwarfed his entire fleet. Massive orbital platforms unfolded like metallic flowers, revealing weapon systems that made his dreadnought's armaments look like children's toys. "Impossible," Krextil breathed. "Our intelligence report showed nothing but a single defended world with primitive technology." What the hegemony hadn't realized was that Kronos had been very, very busy during the months since its awakening. The ancient AI had quietly activated defense networks that had been sleeping for millions of years, hidden throughout not just the solar system, but the entire galaxy. Captain Ji-Ho Kim stood on the bridge of the Incheon, humanity's newest and most advanced warship. It was a beautiful vessel, sleek and powerful, but compared to what was awakening around them, it looked like a fishing boat next to an aircraft carrier. "Kronos," Ji-Ho said, speaking to the air around him. "Please tell me you're not about to commit genocide. These are still living beings, even if they're being stupid about this whole situation." "Nothing so crude," Kronos replied, and there was definitely amusement in the AI's voice. "Watch and learn, Captain. This will be educational for everyone involved." What followed wasn't really a battle. It was more like a masterclass in the difference between thinking you're advanced and actually being advanced. The hegemony's fleet opened fire with their most powerful weapons, plasma cannons that could melt through the armor of any known ship. The energy beams struck the ancient human defense platforms and simply disappeared. The installations absorbed. The attacks like sponges soaking up water, their crystalline surfaces glowing briefly before returning to their normal state. "Our weapons aren't even scratching them," the hegemony's weapons officer reported in disbelief. "It's like they're designed specifically to counter our technology." "That's because they are," Kronos explained, its voice now broadcasting directly into every ship in the hegemony fleet. "Your advanced plasma cannons are crude copies of designs we abandoned as obsolete before your species learned to make fire. Your shields are based on technology you reverse-engineered from our ruins. Did you really think we wouldn't know how to defeat our own creations?" The ancient human defense systems began their response, but instead of destroying the attacking fleet, they did something far more sophisticated. Invisible energy fields reached out and simply turned off the hegemony's weapons. Not destroyed, just switched off, like a parent taking away a child's dangerous toy. "Warning," Kronos announced to the entire galaxy, its voice reaching every communication device on thousands of worlds. "Citizens of the hegemony of suns, your leaders have chosen to make war against those who gave your species fire, the wheel, and the stars themselves. We find this disappointing." What happened next was the most sophisticated act of technological discipline in galactic history. The hegemony's ships found their life support systems gently modified to release a mild sedative into the air. The crews didn't die. They just fell into a peaceful sleep, dreaming pleasant dreams while their ships drifted harmlessly in space. Back on the hegemony's homeworlds, something even more remarkable was happening. Their massive weapon factories, which had been working around the clock to produce armaments for the war, suddenly began retooling themselves. The same assembly lines that had been making plasma rifles started producing musical instruments. Missile manufacturing plants began turning out art supplies and educational materials. "Your industrial infrastructure has been repurposed," Kronos explained to the sleeping crews and the billions of citizens watching from their home planets. "Instead of weapons of war, your factories will now produce tools of learning and creation." Consider this a timeout. The demonstration wasn't lost on the rest of the galaxy. Every species that had been considering joining the hegemony's rebellion suddenly reconsidered their position. If this was what happened to those who chose aggression, what would happen to those who chose cooperation? The Vorthans, who had treated humanity with respect even when they thought humans were primitive, found their territories suddenly blessed with incredible gifts. Dead worlds in their space revealed vast mineral deposits. Their research stations received upgrades that advanced their science by centuries. Their communication networks were enhanced to allow instant contact across their entire empire. The Kelthri Dominion, those four-eyed archaeologists who had genuinely sought knowledge rather than power, received something even more valuable: access to educational databases that contained the accumulated knowledge of ancient humanity. Their scientists wept with joy as they discovered answers to questions their species had been asking for millennia. The Great Silence wasn't a catastrophe, Kronos explained to the galaxy, as everyone watched the one-sided conflict unfold. It was humanity choosing to step back and see if our children could grow into worthy inheritors of the galaxy. Some of y'all passed that test admirably. The AI's voice took on a colder tone as it continued. Others demonstrated that they still require guidance. Dr. Hyun-Soo Jang, who had been appointed as humanity's first ambassador to the Galactic Council, watched from the diplomatic station as the political landscape of the galaxy shifted in real time. Governments that had been hostile just hours before were suddenly sending messages of apology and requests for peaceful dialogue. "So what happens now?" she asked Kronos. "Do we become galactic rulers? Do we punish everyone who opposed us?" "Now. We do what we should have done 3 million years ago," Kronos replied. "We come home. But this time we're not leaving our children to face the darkness alone." That's when Kronos revealed the final, most important secret. The external threat that had driven humanity into hiding hadn't been destroyed. It had only been delayed. The Great Silence had been preparation time, a chance for the galaxy's younger species to mature and grow strong enough to help their predecessors in the final battle that was still to come. "The enemy will return," Kronos announced to the entire galaxy. But this time they won't face humanity alone. They'll face a galaxy united under the guidance of those who built it and the strength of those who inherited it. President Seo Jun-nam addressed both his own species and the alien civilizations in a speech that was broadcast to every world in the galaxy. "Our ancestors gave up everything to save you. They sacrificed their entire civilization, went into hiding, for millions of years, all to protect species they had helped grow and develop. Now it's time for all of us together to save what they built." The galaxy's greatest joke had become its greatest hope. The primitive humans that everyone had tried to uplift turned out to be the ones who had been lifting everyone else up all along. Kronos, watching over its charges with something that could only be described as digital contentment, began the long work of preparing for humanity's greatest challenge yet. The children had come home, and together they would face whatever emerged from the dark spaces between galaxies. The war for galactic civilization was about to begin, but for the first time in 3 million years, humanity wouldn't have to fight it alone. They would have the help of every species they had once saved, standing together against the darkness that was still out there, waiting to return. The reunion was complete, and the real adventure was just beginning.